Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate having you here, especially this last week of August where most New Yorkers flee the city for sunnier shores. Today's talk is a part of the Weiner Research Speaker Series, where Vera welcomes distinguished scholars and researchers to share their work on justice issues, and it's named after, in honor of the former Vera Director and Senior Fellow, Neil, who passed away, and after he passed, we named it after him. So thank you so much for coming. We want to invite you to come to our next speaker series, which is on Tuesday, September 19th, so about a month from now. And Dr. Asada Saad will be here talking about reconsidering immigrant illegality, how immigrants perceive the risk of immigration law and enforcement. So that stands to be a really good talk considering our current climate and environment. We'll hope to see you there. And you can live tweet us on #VeraRSS. I don't know what that means, but good luck and have fun. So today you have undoubtedly come out to hear Dr. Abrams speak about her new book. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then she'll, I'm sure, introduce herself. But she's a professor of social welfare at UCLA in their School of Public Affairs. And are you no longer a professor? Are you something more fancy?
Professor and chair.
Oh, Matt.
Which is less fancy.
It might feel less fancy in the position, but it sounds very, very impressive. And her work is in qualitative research, so she's done a lot of ethnography around young people in prison. She's focused a lot of her attention and career on what happens inside facilities, and wrote a book about that called Compassionate Confinement, to talk about the tension between we want to treat young people, but then we place them in horrible institutions that are involuntary. The horrible was editing on my part, my bad. And that was editorial, excuse me. And then she shifted and did another round of career on reentry. And you're going to get to hear about her research that's on this third wave of her scholarship, which is around young adults and how they make meaning of their interactions with the justice system, with a bit of a focus on their reentry experiences. So thank you so much for coming. I totally forgot to introduce who I am, so I'm going to very quickly do it now. I'm Ryan. I'm with the Center on Youth Justice here at Vera, and I'm so grateful that you all could come. She'll talk for about 35-40 minutes, and that will give us plenty of time for a question and answer, and I'll come back up and tell you all the rules about that. But it might seem weird to talk into a microphone in such a small space, but we have people watching online and are streaming this, so we'll ask that you respect those folks online and use a microphone while we do that. So I'll see you in about 40 minutes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much to the Vera Institute of Justice, and I'm really honored to be here today as part of the speaker series. I've always admired the work of Vera, and so this is one of my career dreams that I get to check off. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk mostly about my newest book. It's called Everyday Desistance. You all received a promotional flyer on your way in. And so after spending the first decade or so of my career thinking about youth incarceration and kind of pondering what does it mean for young people to be removed from his or her home, their school, their family for periods of time, I started to ponder the next phase, which is when young people are trapped in cycles of juvenile justice, of being locked up, of being placed, of being put in out-of-home care, what happens when they then become adults? And our society has a lot of expectations for independence in adulthood. In some sense, we've rolled back that process. We see that kids come live at home after college. We expect people to be partially dependent, partially interdependent. But for these young people, they have a different experience. For formerly incarcerated youth, they don't necessarily have a protected path into adulthood. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, let me see. So our book that I wrote with my former PhD student, Diane Terry, she's wonderful. We try to situate this process, this delicate process of transitioning to adulthood in the context of youth's life histories, and then in the daily challenges that they experience in trying to accomplish many tasks. Desist from crime, meaning termination of offending, meaning a journey from lockup toward a free lifestyle. They want to be free from incarceration, right? But at the same time, they're trying to navigate all the tasks of young adulthood. So just for a minute, think back to when you became a young adult and all the trial and error that took. What comes to mind for you? Just off the top of your heads, what do you think about from, say, 18 to 22? Trouble, okay. What else? Mistakes, okay. What about on the positive side? Anything? Identity work, right? So I just want you to keep those things in mind because those are also the same items, trouble, mistakes, identity, opportunity, experience that the young people in my study were also trying to navigate, okay? So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for those of you who may or may not be familiar with some of the statistics of youth incarceration and young adulthood, and then very quickly going to go over that and then launch into kind of the nitty-gritty of the book, okay? So we are at a period where U.S. incarceration rates are declining, particularly for juveniles. And so one might think, okay, well, is this still a problem? You know, so juvenile incarceration rates have declined about 40% over the last 20 years, and a lot of the alternatives to incarceration movement have been working, or at least having some effect. But still, the U.S. is the leader in youth incarceration globally. Our rates are still higher than most countries. Over a million youth have contact with the juvenile justice system annually. Some type of contact, meaning arrest or diversion, anywhere on that spectrum. Approximately over 200,000 youth are brought to detention centers still. And then when you think about the process of leaving or reentering post-incarceration, which is the group I'm interested in, there's still about 100,000 youth in the U.S. who are released then from a secure, non-secure facility annually. So the numbers are still quite large. There's also a real issue, even though we've had de-incarceration in youth facilities overall, the racial and ethnic disparities of the confined population are still quite staggering. So you can see here that for about 41% of incarcerated youth are African American or Black. This number did not change, this percentage, with any of the decarceration movement. So the needle has not moved in terms of disproportionate minority confinement despite efforts. So when we're talking about formerly incarcerated youth, now we're talking about those who've had kind of the deepest end histories. They have been incarcerated despite our best efforts to decarcerate. They tend to be youth of color, and they also tend to be a lot of youth who've had other out-of-home placement experiences, such as the child welfare system or histories of child abuse and neglect. So New York's had a lot of interesting changes recently around incarceration in terms of raise the age, closing Rikers possibly. I think it's really important to remember that when youth have spent time incarcerated, they have often faced very damaging conditions. These are some photos from Richard Ross's book in 2013 called Juvenile Injustice. If you haven't seen his work, it's available on the web. It's super interesting. He went around the country taking photos of facilities, all in many, many states. And so the conditions of confinement, which often make youth worse. So when they've spent years in and out of detention and cycling through correctional facilities and placements, they often enter into adulthood having had experiences that cause further traumas or that make them more susceptible to mental health and substance abuse issues as well. So not all facilities look like this. In fact, the facilities that I've studied in my first book were much more like group homes than they were like jails. But I think we have to remember that there is no standard of facilities for young people and that they really can be subject to conditions that look rather harsh. So like most researchers, we usually start with the background and what do we know? Well, what we know about formerly incarcerated youth, and I'm talking about around the 18 to 24 range, so the young adults, and youth who've been incarcerated for longer periods of time. So I'm not just talking about detention, I'm talking about those who've been placed in correctional facilities, whether that's adult jails and prisons or youth jails and prisons. We know that one of the biggest problems that they face is school reentry and low educational attainment. So that's been readily established that about less than 25% of formerly incarcerated youth earn a high school diploma or GED upon their release. We know that that's connected to high rates of unemployment or low-wage jobs that often are dead ends. We know also that a lot of the homeless shelter population, or 30 to 40%, are people who've been formerly incarcerated for young adults. And that some of studies have shown that up to 70% of incarcerated youth have some type of diagnosable mental health or substance abuse issue. All of that's to say that the risks of being reincarcerated are about 1 out of 2, sometimes a little bit more depending on where you live, because all of these obstacles can create really barriers to reentry and community reintegration that are hard to overcome. But in my research, what I realize is that from my experience as a social worker, as someone who's worked in group homes, as someone who's been involved in this community for a long time, is that most of the young people I've met who are formerly incarcerated are not doomed to failure, and they're not the poster children for success either. And I think we kind of tend to see the bookends of that experience. We think about, okay, this youth's formerly incarcerated, now they're serving a life sentence. Or the young person who made their way to college and is now the spokesperson or the role model. What I'm really interested in my book and in my research is the road that lies in between. That's the title, Everyday, because I'm interested in the everyday experiences of people who've navigated these roads. And so I don't think that's a story that's been told. So the primary questions that we posed were, how do formerly incarcerated young adults negotiate desistance? So how do they move from years of being involved in crime and gangs to a non-offending or non-criminal belief system, identity, and lifestyle? And how do they do that while they're becoming an adult? And then the third question is, how do young men and women differ in this process? So the research that we did was qualitative. We talked with 25 young adults who'd been incarcerated for over 6 months in their adolescent years. Most, though, had been incarcerated multiple times and for several years of their adolescence. They were 18 to 24 when we met them. There were 17 young men and 8 young women in the study, and all of the data was collected that I'll present, and their quotes with informed consent and fake names, just so you know. Okay. So what we did was we started with 25 young people, and we met them and we recruited them from agencies and did a long life history interview where we found out about their trajectory starting from birth up to the present day. The next interview, we focused really phenomenologically or like in-depth experience on what their transition to adulthood has been like. And we also had them do some social support mapping and talk about their neighborhood context. And I'll show you some of those maps when I get into the results. We purposely chose 10 of the 25 to follow up with in a third interview about 6 months later, just to see how they were doing. And then about 6 stayed in the study for the interviews 4 and 5. So over a 3-year period, we did 70 interviews total, and we invited these 10 to stay, and we ended up with 6 that we were able to follow for a longer period of time. So what was really interesting about that was how quickly people's lives changed in the course of the study. So even between interviews 1 and 2, sometimes their cell phones would be disconnected, they would have moved, one was reincarcerated and we had to go find him in jail. So it was really interesting, just even in the course of the research, figuring out how quickly things were shifting for these young people. So who were the young people in our study? There were, I don't have this on the slide, but 14 were Latino, Latina. There were 9 African Americans, 1 Filipino, and 1 white participant. The average age of the men was a little older than the young women. And so it makes more sense that more of those folks, of the young men, had completed high school than the young women because they were a little older. You'll also notice here that more of the young men were already parents of 1 or more children. So 7 out of the 17 were parents. And that more of the young women were former foster youth, and that has to do with some of our sampling, as well as really overall that the research shows that for incarcerated youth, that for young women, they are more likely to come from the child welfare system for reasons I'll talk about later. And the young men had more often been rearrested in adulthood than the young women. So the book is organized in kind of a developmental trajectory. We talk about the road to juvie, so we go through their life histories and how they got there. We then go through the process of being locked up and the cycle of incarceration. Chapter 4, and now I'm an adult, talks about the road to employment and education. And what I'm going to focus on today is the chapter on desistance for young men and also for young women. So I'm going to give you a little flavor of the book with some stories and some of the key outcomes of the book, and then we'll have a discussion about how do we take this information into policy and practice reform. So Los Angeles County and the youth in this book all grew up in a society that's very divided. Not only divided by freeways, as in the picture, but it's also divided by race and class lines in ways that are very distinctly Los Angeles. Schools, so starting with their experiences in school. These young people grew up in schools that were highly racially segmented and segregated, that were under-resourced, and that often kicked them out and expelled them into the school-to-prison pipeline. 95% in LAUSD of school warrants are for students of color. That's a huge, staggering number. It's very racially divided the schools, and also under-resourced for the schools where these young people went. LA has one of the biggest foster care populations. Over 20,000 youth age out of foster care annually without permanency. And for some of the young people in our study, the child welfare system was who raised them in some way, in and out of foster care. Exposure to violence is high. LA is still kind of the gang capital, and still has a lot of problems with violence, even during a time when murders and street violence were declining. And these young people then face a number of barriers to employment when they get out. Okay, so here's the meat. The young men in our study, and we separate this from the young women because their journeys were very different. The young men in our study ended up, we felt, falling into three groups. Those who were on the road to desistance, those who were running in circles, and those who were still in the game. In the first group, the on-the-road participants, those were young men who were really actively working to change their lives. They were actively working to achieve a lifestyle where they wouldn't be in contact with the law. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a lot of struggles, though. They had a lot of starts and stops, and actually 3 or 4 of them had been arrested as an adult. But that indicator, to me, did not show the efforts that they were making toward desistance. In the running in circles group were 4 young men whose experience could best be described as fits and starts and stops. They really wanted to achieve desistance, but they would put one foot forward and stumble. Some of them didn't have jobs, they didn't feel employable, they got kicked out of their houses, or they were couch surfing. So even though that they had desire at times to reach toward desistance from crime, they couldn't really enact that vision due to a lot of tangible issues with tangible supports and resources. The still in the game folks had a different version of desistance. Their version of desistance was, I don't want to get caught. So they didn't want to be reincarcerated, but they were still making choices that put them at risk because they needed to meet some of their own financial or other resource needs. The reason why I put these as puzzle pieces is because they're very interconnected. We met someone here maybe when they were 22 and on the road, but a year ago they might have been in any one of these categories. These are not distinct typologies. What they are is kind of a picture of where a young adult could be at different points in their journey. So some of the domains that I'm going to talk about is why everyday decisions are critical. So when we think about someone who's been successful in transitioning out of crime, what do most people use as a marker of that, would you say? What is success? Getting a job? Okay. What else? Stable housing. Okay. Any criminal justice folks who are working in the system here? Yes. What do you guys use?
Well, I represent.
Okay, as a marker of success.
I imagine usually fulfillment, stable housing.
Okay. So, arrested, right, okay. I was looking for that. Most people think of a successful young adult who's trying to get out of the game as someone who's not back in the system, right? Thank you. Okay. So what I was really interested in is that marker did not capture the efforts that these young people were making in their lives. So as I said, some of the most successful youth that we saw that had jobs and had stability had been rearrested. So it made me rethink this whole concept of recidivism and desistance. So what I'm going to talk about is the micro-level decisions, the decisions that they had to make every day around these issues in 3 realms: appearance, associates, and traveling, traversing their neighborhoods. So Gabriel is one of the young men who was on the road to desistance. He was 24 when we met, Latino, married, employed, even without a high school diploma, and he had stable housing. What was really interesting about Gabriel was that he had a very hard time desisting. He had been a major drug dealer. He almost had a federal record. He narrowly escaped that. He'd survived being shot. He was a gun wound survivor. And to enable this lifestyle change, he had to completely cut ties with everyone that he knew from his past. One of the things that Gabriel thought a lot about was his appearance. So between the time he was 18 or 19 and 24, he made a series of decisions about how to present to the world an external appearance that would match his internal identity changes. So he talked about going to get jobs early on, and he wouldn't get them because he said, I was still wearing baggy pants. I still didn't look like someone that I wanted to be. One of the things that he talked about was that he had to eventually confront the idea of changing his appearance. He first had his epiphany about this when he had a chance encounter with some of his former gang members. And he thought to himself, they look, quote unquote, dirty. He was happy that the world viewed him as a productive member of society, but he wanted to do more. So he said, and even though I used to wear new clothes, I'd sit and think, damn, maybe I did look dirty. But I spoke to myself, and they said, nah, that's not what I want. I want to do better for myself. So over time, he became more conscious of how he looked, what he chose to wear, and he said he didn't want to look thuggish anymore. He realized that until he changed the way he presented himself to the outside world, that no one would really value the way that he saw himself. So that was kind of an interesting negotiation. Another example of everyday decisions had a lot to do with people that you choose to surround yourself with. So imagine that you're 18 or 19 and you're coming out of incarceration and you don't have anywhere to live and you're not allowed to be around your former friends or some of your family members because they might get you into trouble, or your probation's telling you you can't be around your old gang. So what do you do? So a lot of the people who were kind of one foot in the door and one foot out had struggled greatly with social support. So Chris was one of those young men who was running in circles. At 24 years old, African American, he was already divorced. He had 2 children to support and an estranged wife. He had earned his GED, but got arrested in college for stealing other people's electronics and had spent some time in prison. When we met him, he was 24. He was living in a temporary motel and running some businesses, but we weren't really sure exactly if they were legal or not. But what he said is that his main struggle is around who to call when he needs help. Because we were just talking about this earlier, because when he calls people for help or rides or when his car breaks down, those people might be likely to either have weapons on them or have drugs, and he doesn't want to go back to jail because he has served time as an adult. So he kind of went back and forth on that, and he said, I didn't cut everyone out of my life. I'm still accessible to them, but it's limited. And that was how these young men tended to negotiate their old friends and family, was to try to kind of put one foot in the door and one foot out, because they didn't want to be at risk of further incarceration, but they still needed friends. So for neighborhood and safety, those who were like still in the game, they were still like maybe hadn't really, they hadn't desisted from their gang. So they were still trying to be associated with a gang, maybe selling drugs, maybe not, maybe doing some crimes when they found it necessary. But I don't want to count them out of the desistance process, because in many ways they all still had the same goal of not being locked up again. Carlos was a very interesting young man, and he thought a lot about his appearance and his safety. He had a gang injunction and a 7-year probation period. And a gang injunction in California means if you're caught within a certain amount of feet from people with your gang, you can just be arrested on the spot. So he had to think very carefully about all of his choices on an everyday basis. One of the biggest struggles that he had was his appearance. He said he tried growing his hair out, wearing glasses, he had his tattoos removed, but then he realized that wasn't him. So he got re-tattooed, actually, and he did shave his head again, and he said this caused ongoing problems because he couldn't be dressed, however, but there's something about the way I look, and there's not one time a cop will pass me up. They always pull me over. So his experience was spent really kind of navigating, not being allowed to be around his friends, but making very crucial decisions every day about neighborhood safety and the police. And this is the map that he drew, Carlos. He was very thoughtful in all of this, by the way, about his everyday decisions. So Carlos said, this is my territory and the park, a little bit of the park. And this is LA, as you see, divided by a freeway. That's how we navigate in LA. And these are all the surrounding gangs where he cannot go, because if he goes into those territories, he's at risk of being attacked or shot. But in his territory, he has to avoid the police. So what he says, to do all that, I don't stay anywhere too long. That's his goal. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You wanted to hold the questions?
Or just repeat.
Oh, yeah. What was the question? Oh, okay. This is kind of like east of downtown, but below the freeway. Okay, thank you. So what Carlos said is basically, it was very interesting. He said, I feel mostly safe in my territory, the pink area, as long as I don't stay any place too long. I have to hop around all the time. That said, one of the most poignant quotes from the young man that really represented a really core phenomenological experience was, we are all marked, truly, no matter how much the transformation. So when you think back to those concentric circles I showed that had the different pathways to desistance, even though these folks were at different points in the journey, they all felt that it was very hard to shed the feeling of being marked. So for the young men, and I won't spend too much more time because I do want to get to the young women, those who were on the road put more effort into changing their appearance. That was very important to them. They chose to cut more ties with friends and family that were dangerous for them, more so than the other two groups. And yet still, all of them were cautious about their personal safety, about the police, about old enemies, and sometimes old gang members that would try to pull them back into the life as well. Okay, so I want to spend about my last 10 minutes talking about the young women. So the 8 young women in our research were very interesting. So they did not struggle with desistance in the same way. They weren't necessarily tempted to get back into crime. So in the book, we call their chapter, Finding a Net to Fall Back On. And that was really the essence of their story. Because the balance here was survival, finding housing, finding stability, surviving violence or even threats of violence, gendered violence and other forms. And then figuring out who they could rely on in terms of caregiving. They were either they were mothers or they had to care for a relative or they were caring for siblings. So a lot of them were adopting caregiving roles. And they were also trying to balance personal relationships and family, which was precarious because remember, 6 of the 8 girls had emerged from foster care. So one of my favorite young women in the book, who I talk about a lot, is Irene. And when we met Irene, she was 20 years old. She's Latina, no children. And when we met her, she was unemployed and kind of living precariously. Her housing situation was not stable. She was sentenced to 5 years at the California Youth Authority, which is a state facility, and very few youth are sentenced to the state facilities. It's more, she had a felony on her record. So she was she was tried as an adult and given 5 to 6 years at the State Youth Authority. When she got out, she had $5, no cell phone, and she was now 19. She had a bag of belongings from when she was 15 that she carried with her on the bus. And she said, I already knew it was going to be hard, so I already had prepared myself. I wasn't scared, I was just preoccupied with how to get home, the way. I don't remember where the streets are at. I hope I'm going the right way. When we met Irene, she had been out for 7 months from Youth Authority. She was in her 4th apartment. And at that time, she was living with a woman who was renting a room in a home, and she started to have a part-time job. She was really trying to find safety. Her mother was incarcerated, and she had no family members to rely on. So we thought, okay, she's maybe, she's getting it together. It's so hard. We were so impressed with her resilience. And then 2 months later, we went to interview her again, and she was living somewhere else. And she had moved in with a boyfriend and his family. And okay, so we went to interview her in the family home, and she was so excited because for Irene, she found home. She moved in with this guy, she moved in with the mom, with the siblings, and she felt like she found the home that she never had. So she said to us, when I was incarcerated, I thought I was always going to be alone, just all alone. So finding home was a big theme for her. Interestingly, 2 months later, or 3, for the 3rd interview, the boyfriend had been arrested and in jail for attempted murder, and she still was living with the family. And the boyfriend had also proposed to her at that time, and she accepted. And she thought that even though she didn't know he would ever come home, that the risk of losing that home was too great for her. Flash forward, 8 months later, we find her again. She had left. She left the home, she left the relationship, and she was living with a friend. And she said, she admitted to us that even though the home she found with Javier and his family was so great, that she had experienced violence in the relationship and that she was just used to that. She was abused as a child as well. So this issue for her was trying to balance the finding home with also a family and finding a family. And she's actually doing quite well. I keep in touch with her still. One of the interesting things about Irene, and I cut out a couple of the names here, just blanked them out because if they're identifiable, was that she had very little social support. So in the middle, we asked, okay, who do you rely on the most? and she had put in boyfriend and the family, was in her support circle. Remember, she had met them like 2 months earlier. No one really in the secondary support, a program she was involved in, and some distant relatives in the third area, meaning the tertiary supports. If you contrast that, this is Gabriel. So remember, Gabriel was the one who changed his appearance, who got a job, and he also had cut ties with all of his former friends and family members. He still had a network, wife, father, brother, sister, friends, who were all he connected. Very different from Irene's. And what we found was that the young women who had emerged from foster care were really had very few ties and very few connected ties. And the men, whether they had cut ties or were still in the game, had a lot of social support that they relayed, which is kind of different from our gender expectations that we might think about. So I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip this story, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, a summary about the young women. So what we found, and this is probably not new for those of you who work in the child welfare system or the probation system, was that in a life cycle perspective, for the young women, they had a lot of core experiences of childhood that was with severe family disruption. They were abused, they grew up in severe poverty, they witnessed domestic violence. That led to foster care, where they might have been further abused. They often ran away, started doing drugs and alcohol at a young age, which led them into juvie. So there wasn't a lot in between here to help them stay in the foster care system, because they ended up locked up or even placed in mental health institutions, often several juvenile placements. So some of them had had 7 or 8 correctional placements by the time they were 18. And then they enter adulthood without that secure footing to move forward. So that was a lot of the cycle that we saw kind of from the life course perspective to be able to understand the young women's experiences. So what is desistance for young adults? We get back to the essential question of the presentation, the aha moment. Okay, so first, it's a windy, unpredictable path for sure. There were so many young people that we met who were so amazing. They had gotten into trouble for little things, the dead ends, not showing up for a probation appointment, having a tag on their license that had expired, and all of this really derailed them because they were making progress toward a crime-free lifestyle, but they weren't able to, they didn't feel that the system would help them account for those little mistakes. On the flip side, we also saw people launch through some good luck. One person happened to remember that a probation officer said, hey, if you ever want a job, find this company, and he went there and got a job. Another young woman found that she had a huge trust fund waiting for her from a car accident when she was 5. And so she was able to move out on her own with her girlfriend. So just as there was some of those little mistakes, there was also the flip side of catching a break. That's what we call it in the book. I didn't get to talk a lot about that today. As I've said, I don't think it's easy to capture desistance through any one indicator, particularly not recidivism. And there are some gendered components that we found, but I think that needs more research because our sample size was fairly small. So what can we do as a community? So I am very interested in young adults and kind of this process. And I went back to them and I said, some of those 6 in the study that stayed, I said, look, here's what I found. What would you like? You know, kind of getting the youth perspective. They all focus on prevention. The young people felt that if their family had been around more, if their family hadn't had to work 3 jobs, if they hadn't been so poor, if they hadn't been kicked out and pushed out of school, and if they hadn't had such bad foster homes, that they would not have entered the juvenile justice system. Now, I didn't want to talk about prevention in the book. It's a huge subject. But the youth felt, the young adults felt like that's where we need to focus policy-wise. The second part is what happens in adolescence and young adulthood. We definitely need to continue to decarcerate. We need to continue the alternative to detention strategies that are already reducing the juvenile population in prison. Create a better system of support through young adulthood. And I think we need gangs and policing practices, the registry policies, to allow youth to be humanized and also decriminalized. They don't always want to be marked, no matter how much the transformation. And it's not fair that we do that. Finally, in practice, do any of you work with young adults or youth? Yeah. That's where I came from, the practice world. And I think this is kind of difficult, but in many ways, it was the sustained relationships, the people that believed in them, that stuck with them despite mistakes, despite the setbacks, that really allowed them to launch. Mentors, relatives, and so how do we think about, how do we bring in those informal and formal supports better into these young adults' lives to give them that couch when they need a place to stay? And I will take questions, and I just want to thank everyone for coming, and especially Lachey Henderson, who helped me organize my trip. So I want to thank my co-author, Diane Terry. There's a picture of her because she's not here. And Rutgers Press, who's taken their chance on me now with 2 books. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We have plenty of time, a nice 10 minutes for question and answer. So we'll start with the person in the yellow shirt here, and if you could use the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't expecting to be the first person.
Sorry.
Hi, so I had a question sort of coming back to your early research, and I don't know how much your book talks about this. In my work, I've heard a ton of like judges and probation people make the argument that if young people are sent to facilities that look like group homes or that maybe are more like campgrounds and more aesthetically pleasing, that they won't experience some of these negative outcomes. I adamantly disagree from my experience, but I wanted to know if your research sort of draws any distinctions between the type of facility that a young person is sent to and their ability to maybe get an education or achieve some of those markers of quote-unquote rehabilitation.
Great. So that's a really great question. I know I showed pictures of really like dark, disgusting facilities. So that is really the subject of the research I did for a long time before this. And my conclusion in that was that it does really matter the environment. But what matters more is how staff are trained to also handle young people who are institutionalized. Because they often treat staff, and I was one of these staff. I worked at a locked facility, my first job out of college. And we were just trained to think of them as a problem. You know, discipline, points, levels, timeouts, restraints, you know. And that work was not on the positive side of developing relationships, of learning how to humanize these young people. And I think we didn't even realize, like, wow, you're 16 or 14 or 17 and you haven't even lived in a home with your own bed and privacy for all these years, you know. So I really think a lot of the work needs to happen around the training of adults who work with young people in the institutions, regardless of the context or the environment. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm used to like leading a class. Yeah.
Thank you. I was formerly incarcerated. after age 18 here in Manhattan under Robert Morgenthau, who looks like Freddy Krueger, who's turning 100 on July 31, 2019. That's another story. Do appreciate this. But I didn't have any alternative when I was incarcerated. His former employee, Mark Bedwell, who looks like Burt Wars on Batman, had a West son that should live in a halfway house. Months after, he made an allegation about me. Also, months after, cops threatened to shoot my father because they mistook him for me because we had the same full name. I wanted to go straight home after I was done there because, look, I needed to stay my welcome. I overstayed my overserved time. That's what I've told people in the past. And now you want me to spend time in a halfway house, which I consider a whorehouse, but that's another story. So I thank you for showing us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question over here. Lina?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Abrams. My question is related to how you define and operationalize desistance. I know you said there's no single indicator. Criminologists say that. So how did you distinguish or draw the line?
So, yeah, so let me go back. So we really struggled with that because when in the narrative, you get a lot deeper kind of roadmap for desistance than you do with looking at any indicators. So this is kind of how we ended up defining some of our categories. So like on the road, meaning like, yes, you're clearly on the path toward, I guess we would say, not having conflict with the law, in the sense that you made some of the internal shifts, that you're matching the external to meet the internal, which was very important to a lot of the young men, you know. And then not only cutting ties with old friends, but like being okay with that, because that's a really intensive process. I didn't really get to talk about the loneliness associated with that process, but the young men did like definitely feel lonely, you know, in that. And then, you know, still kind of shedding that feeling of being marked. The young man, Oscar, who made that great quote, and I've used it in papers in the book, we're all marked, no matter how much the transformation. You know, he and I are still in touch, and that feeling is going away for him. But this is now 7 years later, you know. So I think we have to think about desistance as this process that may eventually lead toward not having conflict or trouble with the law, but that really involves a lot of conscious everyday decisions. And that's why I'm hoping the book will build on theory of everyday desistance, #everyday desistance. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask about time for one more question. So if anyone has a question, can you raise your hand, and then I'm going to do the horrible thing and prioritize Vera's stats. So it looks like Hernan has a question. So Hernan, go ahead.
So when you listed out some of the reasons for why somebody would be incarcerated, you listed the housing, you listed you listed the different buckets, and one of the ones that you listed there was the mental health component of this. So I'm curious to know, just in all of your interviews, how that, if in any way, sort of surfaced as sort of really serving as a really large problem for all of them, because they're coming out of incarcerated environments about, you know, with years of trauma, and how that impacts their ability to function in their day-to-day, because again, a lot of this could easily influence the mental health very drastically, and given that incarcerated experience, as someone who was incarcerated as well as a young adult, how that, and you know, either enables or disables their ability to manage some of the different, you know, sort of hiccups that happen along the way.
So in our group, we had young people who had been diagnosed with mental health disorders in juvie, put on medication. All of them had decided that they didn't, you know, want to continue with that process all in our group. And this was, you know, again, a small sample, that they felt they were being medicated in order to behave, not because they had a mental health disorder. The substance abuse was a different story. A lot of the folks that were running in circles, and also some of the young women, were definitely had substance abuse issues that really prevented them from feeling like they could fit in kind of mainstream society. They also were having trouble like getting, meeting job interviews or pulling their lives together economically because they were weighed down by drug and alcohol addiction. So that played into the research a lot more than the mental health, although I guess it could be considered related to, I think, masking the traumas that they had experienced. Yeah. I didn't really get to talk about a lot of that today, but I'm happy to continue the conversation. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Abrams.
Thank you.
I prioritize your staff because they probably all have meetings to run to, but other folks, you're welcome to stay if you have a few more questions.
Sure.
Dr. Abrams has about 15 minutes before her next appointment with us, and hopefully I will see you on September 19th, same time, same place, for Dr. Assad's Reconsidering Immigrant Illegality. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.